I did my Ph.D. dissertation on self-defeating behavior in performing artists. There was one student who was very defiant and a little bit of an attitude in class towards me, and especially towards learning. One day we're discussing something, and she was giving a little attitude. She said, "Oh, I bet you think I am stupid."
We have not had anybody talk about imposter syndrome yet. Let everybody know, Albert, because I think your background's really impressive. You have a PhD, which only 1% of the population actually gets. So that's really, really impressive. But let's talk about why we're going to dive into imposter syndrome and into the core of the content, because I think this is a thing a lot of managers struggle with in the workplace.
First of all, I just want to thank you, Paul, for having me on the show, for inviting me on. My name is Dr. Albert Bramante. I have a background working a lot with actors and performers, as well as students and creatives and entrepreneurs. The one thing that I've noticed, because I've overcome my own sort of imposter syndrome. So the one thing myth that I want to just compel is that imposter syndrome only affects a small part of the population. That's not true. It affects almost everybody at some point in their life, including managers and being really high functioning CEOs or high peak performers. People that are sometimes really on top, what may look like they're on top of their game, are still struggling day to day. You may not know it. They may just be better at hiding it or better at able at masking it to some level. If we look at the textbook definition of imposter syndrome, which really is about feeling like you're a fraud, behind the scenes aspect of it, you feel like you're going to be found out, that people are going to find out that you're not really who you say you are, or you're not that trained. And that's your inner critic,
Right.
the critical part of your mind, even your subconscious, is what's really giving you these messages of you're not that qualified, or you're not that. Who are you to be the CEO, or who are you to be this leader? You're just this humble kid from wherever it is. Who would want to listen to you? And that's your inner critic coming in. Now, how does this inner critic form? Well, your childhood, your parenting, maybe you received some critical messaging from parents and teachers growing up, that became your inner voice. And through your own life experiences, even past failures can sometimes build and accrue, which can then create this loop going on in your mind about, I can't do this, and people are going to find out I'm not a good manager. Now, I want to somewhat normalize this some level, because that's what keeps us humble. I share the knowledge, and I may be a minority in this point of view, but I share knowledge that we can work with it rather than trying to fight it, imposter syndrome. And by working with it, it keeps us humble. It keeps us grounded. If somebody was having these doubts coming in, and very often, unless you have a specialized knowledge, you're not going to really hear people say, "Hey, I have imposter syndrome," unless of course, they've
Yeah.
read up on it. But what
Right.
you might hear is like, "Oh, I don't think I'm good enough," or "No one's going to listen to me." And that's what really imposter syndrome is. The one thing that I would say to that is, well, we'll take a step back and really unpack what exactly do you feel? Where do you feel that people are not paying attention to you? Where do you feel that you're not adequate in? Or what do you think is lacking? You say you're not qualified to be the leader. What makes you think so? As a leader, you were promoted, or you have somewhat of a track record. And then when we bring that up and saying, well, you say you can't do anything, but here's your track record of success. And a lot of times what generally happens when we're in the midst of this, we downplay or we even delete from our mind the successes. That goes out the window for some reason. It is we have temporary amnesia of the success that we've achieved, and sometimes it just takes a gentle or firmly pointing out to somebody, well, no, here's the achievements you've had. Here's what you've done already. You've accomplished a lot. This is great. And so that should be something that, again, should be celebrated and achieved. Then the next thing is, after we figure out or come to the conclusion of like what exactly you feel limited in, the next step is to really do a deep dive or like even an audit of your achievements. Then once we do that, we can then start to reframe the limiting belief by saying, well, no, you've accomplished, look what you accomplished. You do deserve to be here. Now, if they feel this is where where it can be your friend, well, this is what you need to do to get better. Maybe you need to take some extra training in this area or take some extra classes while you're still being a leader and while you're still doing that. I think, especially in leaders, and you probably find this too, is I think leaders have the misconception they must have it all together, that they must be like impeccable. And that's inauthentic leadership. Yes, you are setting the stage in whatever area that you're leading in, but at the same time, you can also be humble and be a human being, be a human leader by saying, look, I'm going to
Hmm.
make mistakes. I'm not perfect. And here's how I'm improving, because then you can motivate the people that you're serving to also improve themselves and better themselves. You're just going first. You're the one stepping in the water for the first time before everybody else does. If you model improving yourself and constantly bettering yourself, no matter what level you're at, it'll inspire your, employees, your, or the people that you supervise that are under you to
Right.
do the best by you showing it. You're taking the first step. I think another thing we would have to do is redefine or reframe what is a leader. And maybe there's some misconceptions of being a leader. Again, some people think that leaders must be perfect, or leaders must have all their stuff together. Well, that may not be entirely a realistic version of a leader.
So what is your PhD in, just for
My
context?
she's in psychology. Now, I was initially going to be a clinical psychologist and researcher. I'm a clinical psychologist by training because I did all the coursework. I did all finish up in all the required courses for PhD in clinical psychology. The next part I really didn't have the time to complete, because the next part of a PhD in clinical psychology is an hour internship,
Correct.
which is
Okay.
about a year and a half, about 18 months of full time work. And
Hmm.
where I was in my life at that time, I had a full time job. I was building a business. I didn't have enough time to do that. I could have done a part time, sure, but I already have all the credits for a PhD. I'm just going to get it into research and education version of
Oh,
psychology.
wow.
I feel a lot better, because
Yeah.
also another thing that, for me personally, the clinical model wasn't working for me much anymore. Because again, this is just my perspective, is that the clinical model, while it was very valuable, was holding people in the symptom disease.
Hmm.
I felt like it didn't really deal with like the positive aspects of things, what makes people right. That's where I want to study more performance side of things. That's where I started
Hmm.
looking like at neuro linguistic programming, NLP, because it's more solution focused, it's more action orientated, and it's really getting people to really help themselves, and equipping people with the tools to be able to not need somebody else eventually and be able to do this on your own.
I always used to look at that type of content with a much more critical eye. When I first got into sales, I remember reading Psycho Cybernetics. I don't know if that book ever hit your radar. There's so
Much
many
almost,
books,
yes.
you know.
I
Yeah.
have it on my bookshelf. It's definitely
Dense read.
yeah. But since I read a couple of them, I liked it, but it was like, yeah, I need time to really, because it's not something that you're gonna read once or two past. You have to do a chapter at a time and digest what he's saying, because there's a lot of information there. But I do like the whole principle of the subconscious and programming that's going on, and that leads to even imposter syndrome too, because
Correct.
goes back to what I was saying earlier about about the deletions of the good things. Because if your mind is focusing on the negative, and when I talk about the human mind focusing on the negative, that's what ideally it's supposed to do. It's what keeps us alive. That's
Hmm.
what kept us alive for thousands of years. Now, we're not in hunter gathering days anymore. We've gone out a long time ago, but our brains still haven't changed. And we needed at that time to be hyper vigilant and looking for threats very fast, because we need to act
Hmm.
fast if our species wanted to survive. Now, because our brains haven't changed, this is why sometimes we're very wired to focus on the negative, where we're attracted to the negative. And this is why it takes a lot of work to retrain that aspect of things. Here's an example. You could be told 20 to 30 compliments. People like your work, but then you get one or two critical remarks that you start to focus on those one or two remarks and you almost negate the good thing. Let me throw those out. But you just got 20 or 30 compliments, and then you start focusing on that instead of taking a balanced approach. Sometimes what I would work with people in that regard or that aspect would be, okay, let's look at both the great and let's celebrate that. But even at the critical side, because a lot of times when we read something critical, our emotion sensitive brain is activated.
Correct.
And when our emotion sensitive brain is activated, we start going into spiraling mode. We started going into like that fight or flight mode where
Right.
we may even distort what we're reading. Oh, this was horrible. I didn't like what I read. Until you sometimes go from a logical framework after you calm down, your logical brain kind of takes over. Now let's look at that feedback again. And it might just be somebody venting, or maybe a troll, or somebody that's just trying to create buzz for themselves. Or perhaps there may be one or two things that are constructive in there that you could say, well, maybe I could do that next time
Hmm.
differently. Feedback. What feedback can you glean from that you can help you propel forward? Because a lot of times when our emotion sensitive brain will read something critical or we get some type of constructive criticism, our brain sometimes will go haywire and say, "But they don't like me. I know it. I'm a failure." And then they never said that. That was never there. Maybe didn't land well for that person, or that approach didn't necessarily work in the way that you wanted it to. What constructive messages can you get out of that feedback? And what can you do differently next time? I've also been a college professor for many years, and I've taught full part-time and full-time. And it's customary that at the end of every semester, the students anonymously evaluate the professors. Common practice. Get these set of evaluations that are anonymous. For me, I would get about 90% would be all satisfactory, but 5 out of 5, and great. But there would always be in every class a few that weren't fans, that weren't happy. Some of them had valid points, and that's where some of the lessons I've learned what to do differently was from that feedback. But I could have easily, and I did this in the beginning. I'd get three, and maybe I'd get like 33 positive reviews and three negative.
Hmm.
And sometimes those would be scathing. Sometimes I would be focused. Oh no, they didn't like me. And they'd be so wrapped up on that. But I have like 20, 30 other evaluations tell me how great the class was. The one thing that I learned from this is that no matter how well you are, and especially as a leader, you're not going to be everyone's cup of tea. And not everyone's going to be a fan of your style. And the goal here is to maximize those that are. And if you do get some critical feedback, what can we glean from that? Let's reframe that to help with feedback. And so that's where we can use the imposter syndrome to improve. Let me adapt the style. Maybe as a leader, some of your employees, some of the people that you're overseeing may not feel heard. Now, maybe you had all positive intentions of hearing everybody, but maybe there was some action that you were taking that could have been perceived as not caring. Now that you know this, maybe the next time you can adapt to that.
I'm curious, you had mentioned earlier in the dialogue, if I recall, how we have that fight or flight mode. Fears kept us alive. You mentioned the caveman days earlier in the dialogue.
Hmm.
I'm curious to know, based on the research and thousands of people you've helped, is it something that you feel we're inherently born with in your research and data, what you've looked through? Or is it something that's typically inherited by our parents and we're fighting against that? I'm curious your
It's it,
perspective.
it's kind of both. I mean, a fight or flight mode is an inborn biological response. Every biological animal has a fight or flight mode already pre-programmed in there, and that's to keep us survive. I mean, the brain's job primarily, or the nervous system job, is to keep us alive, and that's an instinct. That's every biological creature. Stay alive. That's why you would see people having superhuman strength when they're cornered, because adrenaline kicks in, and that's your brain doing whatever it can to stay alive. And also not only stay alive, but keep those around this genetic lineage.
Real quick, the only reason this podcast grows is because of you. When you hit that follow button or you leave us a review, it means the world to me. I did a cost analysis. Each episode, in terms of resources, costs somewhere around $2,500 and upward. We give a lot of this professional development away for free, but what makes the world to me is when you leave a review or you give us 5 stars or just give us feedback so we know how to grow. And I will do everything in my power to make sure that the Manager's Mic podcast is exceptional and serves your professional development. Take care, and back to the show. I feel with imposter syndrome, though, it's difficult because, as you had mentioned earlier, promotions where they feel they didn't earn them play into that variable. And in coaching people and acting and students, is that the catalyst for pretty much most of it, is that people can't break away from just constructive or critical feedback, or is it their own self-image? Which one would weigh more in that other people's opinion or the opinion they have of themselves?
It could be definitely other people's opinions that are coming in, and that influence your opinion of yourself. Again, and sometimes it could stem from your childhood or your family upbringing that we get our viewpoints from. Because really, we get the blueprint of life from our parents or from our early teachers. Then a lot of times we can internalize that until that becomes our own inner critic.
What is somebody who had really bad imposter syndrome, whether it was an actor or somebody in your talent agency, that you gave certain behaviors or solutions to? Somebody who had really bad imposter syndrome, you could pick anyone you want, that you gave them these key habits to start adapting. That way they could overcome that imposter syndrome faster, not fall into the fear of failure, or not be able to launch themselves forward more.
When I was first starting building up becoming an agent, the reason why I went down this road was I was noticing a lot of actions were self-sabotaging. They were shooting themselves in the foot. Their verbal actions were telling you how much they wanted to. Their actions were telling you the story. Their actions were not matching their verbal, and their actions were causing them to turn down auditions, be late to auditions, not show up on auditions, or whatever it was. And I couldn't necessarily in the beginning figure out the disconnect. And that's why I did my PhD dissertation on self-defeating behavior in performing artists, because this was a pattern that I was seeing, even in my students, because I saw this in my students that were very smart and very talented, but they would not come to class. They would deliberately not read the book, and they would wind up failing, either out of the college or even the class. There was one student who, I don't want to say that she was, I don't like to use the word troublemaker, but she was very defiant. And even it was, college, a little bit of an attitude in class towards me, and especially towards learning. I think the switch was one day we're discussing something, and she was giving a little attitude. She said, "Oh, I bet you think I am stupid." And I turned around and said, "I think you're incredibly intelligent. I think you're an incredibly remarkable, intelligent person. I'm going to ask you a question. Do you agree with that?" And I almost saw her fighting tears with that. She didn't pass the class, but she took me again. There could have been other professors, but she deliberately chose my class again and wound up doing very well the next semester. And I still keep in touch with her on social media. I could have easily had labeled her and written her off and even asked her to leave, but I chose not to because I saw through it. I knew exactly what was happening. Another student, I got an anonymous email saying, "Professor, I don't think it's fair that you're asking students to participate." And I'm okay with that dialogue. Instead of defending it, I answer her back, "Why do you feel that it's not fair?" Because some students are shy. And I said, "Well, just think about it this way. We're looking at 25 people in the class. There's 25 different viewpoints. There's 25 different perspectives. How much value do you think you would get from learning, not just from me, but from the other 24 of your classmates in there? And I bet you have great life experience too that you can participate." This student, the first couple of weeks, would not speak at all. By the end of the semester, we were one of the most vocally participatory students in the class, and
Hmm.
took another class with me in the next semester, another course I was teaching, and participated fully in there. So even with actors, I sometimes will talk an actor out of quitting. Look at that
Oh, really?
get that a lot. Like I'm going to leave the business. This isn't working. Of course, if something is really not making me happy anymore, I can understand pivoting. I don't necessarily look at that as quitting. I just look at that as pivoting. You're just doing a strategic pivot. However, if you're doing it just because out of fear or out of emotion, let's talk first. Why did you want to become an actor? Well, I want to tell stories. I want to embody different characters. I want to tell stories. I want to inspire other people. Okay. Well, let's look at it this way. Let's reframe it. What do you do when you go on an audition? Well, you perform a role. What if we reframe it rather than as an audition, but as an opportunity to perform, tell a character, inspire other people, even if it's the three people in the room that you're auditioning for. And sometimes that little reframe is like bam, because now it's the same principle. We're just reframing it in a different context. Rather than looking as you're being judged, now we're putting the empowerment onto you. No, here's your chance to perform. In reality, they hold auditions because they want to find the next person to play that role. They're not doing it to judge you. That's your inner critic talk. An actor will call me up very upset after they had an audition. They didn't like me. And I said, well, what makes you think that? I know they didn't like me. I said, well, so did they tell you I don't like you? Well, no. Well, why did you think that? Well, they didn't smile. Maybe they're not a smiling type of person. Maybe they're in work mode. Maybe they have their own bad day. Who knows? And the one thing I try to educate is not to read into situations that much. Because I remember another time I had an actor who called me up saying she was so upset she thought she blew it. They had her do one read only, and then they said thank you. We saw enough. And she was, I know they didn't like me, and she was like really upset. Why did they give you the job? And she went, what? Congratulations, you were hired. And then maybe they said we saw enough because they liked you, but they also had a crowd of people ahead of you and a short
Hmm.
amount of time that they had to get these auditions done.
It's difficult though, because in society, I feel, and I was talking about this with my wife, the number one question we ask each other is, what do you do? And we tie ourselves very much to who we are and to our professional identity. And we tie a lot of our personal into that question. Nobody asks, how are you doing? Especially amongst strangers. I follow another podcaster who is saying that only 6% of students in her survey want any leadership role in a company. Reflecting on what I just said, the fact that we tie ourselves much to just the basic question of what do you do, and the fact that some data points are coming out that people don't even want leadership roles, people don't even want to be middle managers anymore. It's starting to kind of swing that way. Where do you feel imposter syndrome is playing into the data and into that micro level of someone just saying, what do you do for a living? Because if you don't have a successful career, I was a college dropout. I had a
Hmm.
teacher who said, Paul, you're too dumb for college. And I made the mistake of letting that
Avoiding.
hold on for 10 years. What is your
Hmm.
professional perspective on the data, where it's going, where people are not wanting to be managers, people are really not wanting to be leaders, and how we can overcome that question of what do you do if you haven't found what you want to do?
Something to unpack there. The one thing that I would say is from that data point, it's hard to generalize from survey data. I mean, it'll tell us what, but not the why. That's where descriptive
Mm,
data limits itself. But it's great for words for data points. I would then maybe follow up if we can somewhat track the people that say they don't want to be managers. Follow up with the why. Now, maybe particularly at their life moment, maybe they're starting a family, or maybe they're not planning on staying there. They have their eyes set on another company. So why would they want to set roots as a leader if they're looking at another career? Or another factor is that they're fearful of that. The added pressure, the consequences that can become of being a leader. I was reading an article a long time ago in New Yorker magazine was female employee was saying that she was eventually hired to be CEO of her company. She ranked up, she promoted, she got really promoted to higher senior leadership. And the one thing that she said, it was a dream come true with certain strings attached. The strings attached were all of her friends that were coworkers. And these are people that she would go out with on a weekly basis, drinks, dinner, and sometimes even on the weekends they would do things together. Almost everybody distanced themselves from her. She found herself
Hmm.
not being invited out anymore. That was an unintended consequence. That's sometimes maybe in the back of somebody's mind to be why they don't want to be promoted because they don't want the responsibility, and maybe they don't think they can handle it. Or again, what I said earlier, maybe they don't see their future, long-term future in that company. So I think there would have to be some follow-up interviews or follow-up questions to really ascertain or figure out what exactly is going on. Now, to answer your other question, I would say, what are you
Hmm.
good at? For me, I would say if I didn't have a business or a teaching thing, I would say I'm a connector. I connect people. In America, at least in the Western world, well, tell me about yourself. Well, I do this, and that's what you do, and that's not what I asked you. Who are you? Yeah, several factors to identity. Who are we? A son, a husband, father, a wife. What religion are we? What political affiliation are we? What ethnicity are we? There's so much factors in our identity. Personality traits do we have? That's our identity too. We're so much more than what we do for a living.
Are there any frameworks or skills or things you teach that they can adopt to help themselves?
It's okay to be human and humble and make mistakes while you're doing it, and even being transparent. I don't think there's anything wrong with a leader apologizing. I was wrong with doing this. Let me make it right. Even as a teacher,
Right.
sometimes I would come in with an assignment idea, and when I was first starting out, I would start to have the class immediately. Look, we're strapping that. It didn't work. I apologize. Let's do it
Hmm.
differently. And I think rather than trying to put this mask on of being perfect and doubling down on what's not working is not going to be effective. I think a lot of times it's just experience. You got to start, and I think especially as a first time leader, you are going to make mistakes. I mean that's the reality of it. And even leaders of 20, 30 years experience are going to be making mistakes time and time. We're human beings. We're not gods. We're not deities. We're
Right.
we're we're human. We're gonna make mistakes.
I have a lot of female professional workers in my circle, CEOs, women, stuff like that.
Yes.
And sometimes we'll be out and they'll share with me that it's much harder for women in the workplace, going back to your earlier example. And I always hear that, and I think there's a level of truth to that. What are your thoughts on different genders and different ideologies or people from different backgrounds?
Men were so conditioned for centuries to be the leaders.
Right.
So sometimes now to work for a woman or report to a woman might be a stigma. Now, going back to the article I was telling you about earlier about that female CEO getting promoted, she said there were a lot of rumors that were being passed about her about how she got to her position because there
Mm,
is a double standard that men get promoted by achievements, but for a woman, a lot of times, at least in the past, it was who did you sleep with to get there, rather than by her own merit that she got there. What she found surprising was she thought that the men that she was like her male coworkers would have been the ones starting the rumors, but she was very shocked to see that a number of her female colleagues that she thought were her friends, former colleagues, were
mm-hmm,
also talking behind her back about her doing the main CEO. That's why she got the position, and
hmm,
that was what was hurting for her. I could see that being an issue too. That competition sometimes within female, the competition that sometimes can happen from within. And I was hearing
mm,
another psychologist that was saying that just general, and I don't like to use generalizations, but the psychologist said you really are not going to have four women in a group without somebody talking about the other three. I think the struggle is not only just for men, but also dealing with the infighting from people that should have your back, which you would think were
correct.
the other women. That's not in every case, but I would definitely explore that. Tell me about the infighting. Tell me about what you notice with your female colleague.
I don't think there's anything wrong, in my opinion, with this. They always say it's lonely at the top. You've heard that statement.
Oh, yes.
I personally feel there's nothing wrong with being alone at the top.
No, and actually, I mean, it'll give you peace of mind to some aspect because you don't have to deal with things. And you can there's also a valid argument that you really shouldn't be friends with the people that you're overseeing. The elephant in the room could be you may have to fire somebody that you really maybe genuinely care for. Well, I think if you have that separation, it'll be easier to make those decisions. I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, okay, there's only a top, but maybe outside of work, you should have, companionship and friends. Outside that, maybe totally outside of your company and outside your industry.
It's hard though. And it's hard to do that. I agree. And we've talked a lot about a lot of good insight that you've shared to peel that onion to get more comfortable with imposter syndrome. I mean, my personal belief is more women should be promoted to management. And I'll say this, anytime I've been
Yeah.
hired or have had actually some of my best corporate training experience, a woman always, in my experience, is very professional, returns my calls quick. Their etiquette is through the roof. And I don't want to generalize. I'm not saying men don't do it too. I
Yeah.
just want to be clear. But in my experience, I feel I get a lot of good professionalism. So I'm hoping more women get opportunities in our country in general.
And
That's just, and maybe I'm pandering, but
key.
I'm being sincere.
I don't think it's pandering at all. I think the end of the day is who's the most qualified to do that job.
Correct.
Who's most qualified to be that leader? And let's strip away the gender from that equation. Who's the most qualified? And again, that might be the female. Being a CEO can sometimes really run a company very well. And there's so many hundreds of companies being run by successful companies that are female run and led.
What are you excited about for the talent agency, the people you're helping now?
Excited about is the ease of accessing information now. Because of the growth of podcasts, because of growth of AI, and because of all of that, there's so much accessible information we can do to really improve ourselves. And there's different ways of like doing things differently with social media reach. 10, 15 years ago, we really didn't have that high degree of reach that we have now of influence that we can be. Even now, being on shows like this or other things for me, I get to converse with people around the world, that I may not have normally been able to do. So I'm excited for that.
Anything you're promoting.
You can just follow me on LinkedIn to get access to that. I publish also some articles on LinkedIn, newsletters on LinkedIn. And then on my website, albertbramante.com, I have a lot of recordings. They're anything from confidence, addictions, leadership, public speaking. So I would encourage you to check out my library.
I'll put all that in the show notes. 100% Albert. I am curious since you had brought it up because we're talking about the age of AI and all that. And AI is on everybody's mind every day. It's almost getting to the point where you're like, I want to turn my phone off for a while. Like rhetoric, anything around AI and imposter syndrome into how it's contributing to this variable, in your opinion?
I come from the perspective that we shouldn't be dependent on AI, but we can use it to amplify our message or come up with different brainstorming ideas with content creation. But it should be a tool to help you, not a tool to replace what you're doing. Because AI will never replace your experience. At least from my perspective, I'm not worried at all about AI taking jobs over. Because it cannot really take our own experience. It can give us general platitudes, but it's not going to be able to make the human decision. Because if I want AI to give me something good, I have to prompt it good. So I have to spend a lot of time putting my own information in there. Otherwise, it's going to give me very generic cookie cutter Hallmark-esque type stuff, which is not going to really be helpful.
I agree with you, especially that study with MIT where it said that sample group of people who used AI or ChatGPT had 43% less critical thinking based on how they conducted that. So I agree with you.
The mistake that a lot of people are making is, hey, this is what ChatGPT said. It must be true. No, it's not. It can hallucinate. It can make up stuff. and your own experiencing. So if anything, I would say maybe 40 or 50% of the information that you get from ChatGPT, you should utilize that, and that's maximum. The other 50% has to come from at least, and I'm talking minimum 50%, your own critical thinking, your own